members. So we're now starting the official AGM, and I take over the chair for this. So the minutes of the previous AGM of 2020, which again was a Zoom one, have been circulated before this meeting. So anybody got any questions to ask about those minutes? If you can, I find it difficult enough to remember a real meeting, never mind a Zoom one. So I can see nobody raising any questions. So the minutes are proposed, we accept the minutes are proposed by Chris Barney and seconded by Tony Crosby. Now, Bill, can you just briefly say what we're doing about voting?
Yes, I'll be putting up a series of windows on your screen for you to approve or otherwise the proposal. And you just have to tick the box in favour or against or abstain. And that's all gets recorded anonymously. Your votes are not attached to your name or any other identifying feature, so it is all anonymous. And you will see the result of the vote on the screen after everybody's voted.
So,
should we demonstrate that with the first one?
Yeah.
And this is for members only to vote.
So you tick the circle that is the one you want to vote against. And then you need to submit it.
Just wait a moment for the clicking to die down. Has everybody finished? It looks like it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In that one. Very large majority in favour, a few abstentions. Can you see that all right, Michael? That's because I haven't clicked that.
Okay, thank you very much. We move on to item 2.
Oh God, what's that?
Matters arising, according to David DeHaan, there are none. But if anybody listening in has a matter arising from last year, wave your hand or shout out. Well, there are none in that case, and we therefore move on. We have a general report from the Council of Management. This is one that has been sent to you and is the one that we have to send to various things like the charity commissioners and that in due course. I'm personally have no matters that I want to raise because I've seen it many times already, but does anyone else? Okay, well, with that, we again go little vote. Bill?
Okay, I think everybody's voted.
Okay,
96% in favour.
no one against, that's the important. Abstain, probably they didn't take part last year. Okay, we now move to the man in Mablethorpe. Sitting in his car, and he's going to give a report on our financial position.
Bill, can you share
John
the,
Jones.
Bill, can you share the screen, please?
Just a moment.
Oh,
Ah, I beg your
Yeah.
pardon.
Yeah, next one. Good. Next slide, please, Bill. Right, now this is a very summarized version of the accounts sent to you in the AGM papers, which are themselves a summarized version of the full accounts, which are on our website and have gone to the Charity Commission and Companies House already. You can see that our subscription income is down a smidgen, about £1,000. Bank interest well down for reasons we all understand. No conference surplus, of course, because there wasn't a conference. The deficit is small amounts of money that we had paid in advance of the proposed conference, both the Liverpool and the Dublin one, particularly travel expenses of John McGuinness visiting the places to reconnoitre and deal with people. So that's money we've had to write off, thanks to COVID. Our expenditure is much the same. The publications figure is minus the amounts we've received for selling copies. The awards are down. Administration and governance is well down, and there are two main reasons for that. The first is that we have saved significantly on travel expenses and room hire for council meetings, which we've been holding on Zoom. The second one is that there are some costs in there for entertaining award winners who come to the conference and are provided with meals and entertainment. So that figure of £4,000 is nicely down. It, we hope, won't be down again next year. So the end result is we've made a surplus on the year, not a lot different from the previous year. Moving on, next slide, please, Bill. We have money given to us for a specific purpose, and under the Charities Act legislation, we have to account for these as restricted funds. It's given to us for a purpose, we've got to spend it on those purposes, so we hold it in a restricted fund. The Neveson legacy has earned a bit of bank interest. We've given some money in awards. The Restoration Grant Fund, thanks to our very generous anonymous donors, has received £100,000 in the year. Sorry, 150. That 150, by the way, includes £30,000 of gift aid recovery. And we've given out a little less this year, or last year, than usual, because we hadn't got the same number of projects that we really felt we wanted to back, so we had a little bit of money back. And finally, the awards fund, we've spent £500 and still have 1,100 in hand. There's some questions in the chat room. Let me just see what they are. They seem to be not relevant to what we're talking about now. So I assume we have no questions on the figures so far. Bill, can you move on quickly to the next slide? Right. This is our balance sheet at the end of the year, and you can see we have bucket loads of cash in hand. The reason, of course, is because we received restoration grants from our donors, and we don't spend the money straight away. We approve projects, and it typically takes up to 2 years before the work is completed and we hand out the money. So we've got £295,000 of creditors, which nearly all of that is grants awarded but not yet paid. Now, legally, we have no liability to the donors we promised grants to. They couldn't sue us if we refused to pay. But accounting standards require that if we've created an expectation in their minds that they're going to get the money, we have to record it as a liability. Quite right too. So our net assets, after taking off those liabilities, are a very healthy £253,000, up slightly from the previous year. And again, most of that money is in restricted funds, which means that we have to spend it on the purpose for which the money was given. That's the last slide, I think, Bill. Any questions, please bring them up as questions. Good.
Anybody? Well, I'll get in the first question. We've got no intention of raising subscriptions, have we?
I don't think it's justified at the moment. We've lost a few members in the last year. We lose a few every year through death and infirmity. We gain a few, and our numbers are broadly consistent. Bruce Hedge has done quite a lot of analysis of our new membership, and I think it's true to say that of the new people who join, 2/3 of them will drop out within the next couple of years. 1/3 will remain. So quite a lot of the members who lapse are people who had joined in the last couple of years and decided it's not for them. The main thing is we have to keep renewing our membership. We need to get them in. In view of our financial position, I see no point in raising subscriptions at this stage. But thanks, David. A good question.
Someone else waved a hand.
Very good question from
Bruce.
Yep, I just wanted to be clear where the Patrick Knott legacy resides.
That is a designated fund. The Patrick Knott legacy, we agreed we would spend on awards to, what was the exact purpose? Travel and so on for students, I think, and research. Yep. Because the legacy didn't contain any conditions, we don't treat it as a restricted fund, we treat it as a designated fund. Now, we took the decision to designate it, and we can equally, if should we decide, undesignate it again. It's £30,000, it's included in the unrestricted funds, and as yet, I think none has been spent.
I just think we ought to show it separately. If people leave a legacy to the association, I think we should be duty bound to show the movements on that legacy for the benefit of the family that's left behind.
That's absolutely valid, Bruce. There's not in my, I've deliberately highly summarized these figures for the sake of clarity and simplicity. In the figures circulated to members and in the full published accounts which are on the website and have been filed, the designated fund is shown separately, quite rightly. But you're right, Bruce, and next year I will make sure that that figure is highlighted.
Are you happy with that answer, Bruce?
Yes, thanks, indeed.
There's another question asked. Let's just bring that one up. Have any of the projects awarded grants fallen by the wayside in the last 18 months? No. Several have been delayed because of COVID restrictions. A couple have been delayed because of unexpected hitches. Typically, when you start to restore an old piece of machinery, something unexpected crops up, and that has delayed a couple. There is one long delayed project, which is the Ride Tramway Restoration, tramway car, which is actually picked up again after several years delay. In the new grant awards we're making, we do put a time limit of, I think, 3 years on starting work. And if they haven't started work in 3 years, the grant will be withdrawn, but unless they've got a good reason for it. They can, of course, reapply when they're ready to start. one or two projects have actually gone on better during lockdown.
If I could comment on that.
Yes, please do, Keith.
Certainly, as John has pointed out, there are a lot of delays in most of the projects because of COVID, and the applicants have been very conscientious and saying, is the grant still available and this sort of thing. And we've said we are obviously waiving the a closure on it because of circumstances. So, but in fact, the ride tram was the only one that seemed to have gone missing, and then it's been accomplished and been paid off, and it was the baby of Mark Sisson's before I took over restoration grants, so that we've got nothing outstanding and nothing at present to worry about as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Keith. Can I urge you all, please, to go on our website and look at the full report and accounts. You will find it fascinating reading, and in the notes, there is a full list of all the restoration grants that we have given in 2020, to whom and what they're for. So well worth looking at that. I'm sure most of you will have looked already at the full accounts on the website.
Of course.
Of course. That's all from me, I think. Unless you've got any more questions.
Any more? Can't see anything. Nothing's appeared on the chat. Okay, well, in that case, we have to take a vote to adopt the income and expenditure account, as we've just heard. The proposer is Marilyn Palmer and the seconder is Bruce Hedge. So over to the voting scheme system.
I'm going to abstain for obvious reasons.
Well, please do. Actually, I don't think technically you have to.
No, but I don't feel like marking my own homework, really.
I thought the auditors did that.
Well, they have done it.
Okay, I think the bar chart has stopped moving.
%. There must be 50 people voting.
Yeah, you're the one abstention then in that case.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for that.
Thank you. You can close that screen. For a moment, I have to hand over to. Oh no, I don't. Not at this stage.
Not at this
It's
stage.
the next one. Next step.
Your
So
bit.
it now comes to me to give my chair's report to this AGM. And I'll start with a statement really of the obvious. It goes without saying that the last year has been the most difficult for the association in its 50 years in existence. The COVID pandemic meant that all our normal activities were either cancelled or significantly changed. And that even includes our council meetings, which have all been by Zoom. The most serious, though, was the cancellation of our conference, as you've heard from John, which was to have been in Liverpool. And we need to make this year's gathering, the coming year's gatherings, just a series of virtual sessions. But next year, we'll hopefully get back to actually real meetings. Our thanks, though, must go to John McGuinness, Bill Barksfield, and the members of the Merseyside Industrial Heritage Society for putting together our virtual events over the summer. They've attracted good attendances, although, as we've just heard, could be larger. Hopefully, we will return to actual meetings next year. And we've started planning such events, as you've just heard, and I've just been told we're looking to be in June for a weekend meeting in Liverpool. There's a possibility of another meeting as well next year. And of course, it looks like we've just heard about a Poland trip. Then the year after, the conference will maybe consider changes after the celebration of the 50th anniversary. which David DeHaan is starting to work on at the present time, with a plan that it be at the Black Country Museum in Dudley in 2023. Even given this year's difficulties, our awards have been made, as you've just heard to some extent. Although applications were somewhat smaller this year, than the judging teams have still had to work very hard, possibly even harder, because they couldn't actually go and see anything. Our thanks especially go to Keith Faulkner for coordinating what really is a substantial sum of money in our restoration grants in the changed circumstances of the past 12 months. But our biggest thanks, as we've just heard, must go to our exceptionally generous donors. And I suppose plus the taxman for giving us the gift aid. Over the last few years, we have helped us distribute over £1 million in industrial heritage restoration awards to many organisations, ranging from the small to the large. I've been especially pleased to witness the development of the Younger Members Board into a very active section of the association. It's been involved in an international conference with China in organising that through Juan, who's looking in at the moment, as well as our annual research seminar the other day, which they helped organise. And we want to see them go from strength to strength. Members will have noted that the IA News has a new editor, Pat Bracegirdle, who took over from Chris Barney, who, having edited 38 editions, decided to retire. It's sad that Pat cannot be with us today because she's had a serious fall and has just come out of hospital with a lot of rather major bruising and a lot of pain. That's why David DeHaan is having to look after her at home today. Pat, though, is in the process of stamping her new designs and new thoughts on the publication, and we see how that develops over the next few editions. Under the joint editorship of the two Ians, Ian West and Ian Miller, the IA Review continues to attract a good flow of papers, increasingly from around the world. Ian West also leads our social media group, who produce a regular email communications. That could be particularly important over the next month or two while Pat is recovering, to keep you in touch. I hope you're all registered to receive the email communications from the group. And of course, other people continue to add regularly to the IA Facebook pages. The association, we've continued to develop its relationships with other bodies, including the all-party parliamentary group on industrial heritage, which is now chaired by Stephanie Peacock, Nick Simmons-Thomas having been elevated within the Labour Party to a front bench role, and also with Historic England, especially via Shane Gould. We've given some pump priming assistance to the second International Conference on Early Engines, which is being held at the Black Country Museum in Dudley in a couple of weeks' time. And it's good that we're able to put in a small amount of money to organisations like that. Dr. Mike Neville, who's there, oh, he looks up because he is, and waves at us because he is his name, is our Industrial Relations Support Officer. He has been very enthusiastic in this role, given the changes caused by COVID-19 to the groups he's dealing with. The association agreed to increase its financial support to the IHSO, the officer, during 2021 and a little bit, and I believe developments are moving ahead to try and get more larger sums of money from other organisations in the coming years. And no doubt Mike will keep the council fully informed on that one. He's kept members up to date, though, with what is really sadly there that we're seeing an increasing number of sites appealing for funds. You know, we've seen he sent out an appeals from Crofton Pumping Station, Whitchurch Zinc Mill, and Dr. Francis's Fawcett Industrial Steam Museum up in Norfolk, all of which have got problems, often because equipment and machinery hasn't run for the last 18 months. And things like steam boilers are starting to fail their inspections. I suspect, though, that some of what I've just read out, unfortunately, these probably just the tip of the iceberg, and we wait to see what other sites will need help. Many of you probably know more than I do. John Jones, as you've just heard, continued to look ably after our finances, and I'm pleased to see that membership numbers on the whole have remained fairly static given the situation. We have, though, been saddened to record in the last year or more the deaths of some important and early members of the association. I think particularly of our past president, Angus Buchanan, and his wife, Brenda. And then shortly afterwards, John Stengelhoffen, who produced most of the regional conference guides that we'd had over the last 20 odd years or so. Finally, my thanks go to all on the committee for helping the AIA and industrial heritage in general through these difficult times. A special thanks I send as well to our Zoom master, Bill, who has kept us connected over the last year. And then personally, I wish to thank David DeHaan, our Honorary Secretary, who's helped me as a, you might say, fresher chairman to hold myself and the association together over the last year, and wish him well in his efforts to nurse Pat back to fit health. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I think at this point you're handing the meeting over to me.
Yes, for the next item.
Because my job as president is to nominate David Perrett to continue as our chairman. He's just given a very thorough and interesting report. He's done a lot to hold the association together over the last year. So I'm hoping that there will be a proposer and a seconder. The proposer is Ian West. The seconder is Bill Barksfield for David Perrett. So I'll hand over to you, Bill, for the voting. Right. Thank you very much. You're duly elected, David.
Thank you. I was wondering whether to press against.
Not at all. It wouldn't work if you did.
Oh, it's blocked, is it? Thank you. Definitely. So back to the official agenda. The next one is the election of officers. First of all, to elect David DeHaan as Honorary Secretary and John Jones as our Honorary Treasurer. The proposal is, well, proposed by Michael Messenger, and Jeff Wallace has seconded it. So over to the vote. Well, 100%. Excellent. Item 8 on the agenda is the election of members of council from those who are required to stand down. So to elect Keith Faulkner, who you've heard particularly runs the Restoration Awards and the team that looks after that, and Ian West to the Council of Management. The agreed proposer is Amber Patrick, and that's seconded by Zoe Arthurs. Can we do the vote? Yes. Wait for the outcome. Okay, thank you very much. We have in item 9 to elect our independent examiners. This is to elect Scrutton Bland as the independent examiners of our accounts. It's proposed by Mike Neville and seconded by John McGuinness. So if we could vote on this one. I don't think there's anything you need to say about them, Mr. John? Jones, that is. No. And the outcome is very acceptable, 95%. So thank you for that. I don't know if there are any other reports from members of the association. Zoe, can I butt in here and ask if you've got anything to say on behalf of the young members?
Hi, I sent a report over to David, but I think most of it's going to be covered in the upcoming council meeting. Just that things at the moment are going well, and our new chair, Vanessa, is doing a brilliant job of carrying us all along. So nothing else to report at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else wish to say anything? I can see no flags going up or anything. Okay, well, thank you for that. Is there any other business that you would like to raise that should of relevance to the association? And again, I can see no flags appearing. So we come to the date of the next AGM. That is we will have to leave it to council to say when that will be, because it will depend upon arrangements being made for maybe real, maybe Zoom AGM next year. And where it will be, how it will be, will need to be decided by council. Council will meet again if any of you have got any business you wish to put to council, and you put business to council via David DeHaan in Ironbridge by emailing David, because we meet. Council is actually going to meet for real at the very end of October, the 29th of October, 30th of October. So any business anyone wants to raise, please send it direct to David DeHaan to have it put on council agenda. At that meeting, we hope we might be able to, when we've discussed meetings for next year, be able to fix a date and time for an AGM in 2022. With that, I thank you for attending the AGM. That's 65 people. Majority, I think, are members. So good to have you all along. Now, so it's now back to Marilyn, and we've got a bit of a pause now.
Normally on a Sunday morning, this is where you will go and have your coffee in between the AGM and the Rolt lecture. Cassie Newland is talking on international telegraphy, and she'll be joining us again fairly shortly, but her lecture is actually scheduled to begin at 3:30. So I think we mustn't start before that, because she might not often be here yet. I don't know whether she is, Bill, is she?
I am here.
Oh, you are,
Oh,
Cassie.
oh,
I was listening in.
You were listening in.
welcome. Welcome.
Welcome very much.
Hi.
I think perhaps, Cassie, we'd better give people 10 minutes to have a break, because we've been sitting here quite a long time. So if we could start again about 3:20.
Yes.
Yeah.
Would that be
take-
okay?
See you back at the 20 past.
3:20 then. So for everybody there, for the annual Rolt lecture, which, as you know, is given in honor of our founder, LTC Rolt, will happen at 3:20, and Cassie Newland from Bath Spa University is going to be with us. I'll see you then. Right. It's a very American voice comes out there on that. Right. As you know, we've had every year a Rolt lecture in honor of our founder, LTC Rolt. I probably was one of the first not to have known LTC Rolt personally, and obviously Cassie didn't, although there have been one or two since who have. Cassie is only the second of my gender to have done this talk. I didn't ask Cassie to do it for that reason, but it would be rather nice if rather more women were able to do it. Cassie is an archaeologist who specializes in the modern world. And I presume, Cassie, you were one of those who excavated the transit van.
Oh yeah, that was all my idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it might
We
be.
had lots of fun with that.
I wonder any of you read about this or remember reading about excavating a transit van to see how the contents of archaeological trips actually turned out. So Kathy's done prefabs to transit vans, mobile phones to machine guns, rubbish dumps to railways. Cassie has spent the last 15 years exploring the many ways in which telecommunication technologies have changed our world. Currently, she's senior lecturer in heritage and public history at Bath Spa University, and is a regular broadcaster, so he's rather used to what we're doing at the moment. She's writing a book about international submarine telegraphy for the Routledge series, Archaeologies of the Contemporary World. And she has the fascinating title, which is highly relevant given what I've been reading about lately, The Tools of Empire, Decolonizing Imperial Telegraphy. Now, normally we don't ask our Rolt lecturer questions, but would you mind, Kathy, if people actually put any questions on chat?
I am really happy to take questions.
You're really happy to take questions.
And
That's
also
absolutely fine.
And extra steers and bits of information, because I noticed we've got people like Bill Burns here as well, so he's bound to have extra stuff to tell me. So yeah, anything.
Okay, so we'll break with tradition and ask people if they do want to ask a question to ask it on chat, and we'll see what we can get through at the end of the session. The paper, of course, will be published eventually in Industrial Archaeology Review. Okay, Kathy, over to you.
Okay, well, it's lovely to sort of see some of you, but it's nice to know you're all there. Just going to work out how to share my screen.
I'm sure Bill will help.
It's all right. I think I've got it. As long as I don't share my notes. This is the trick. I just share the other
Green
thing.
bottom,
So
that's
can you
it.
see my slides okay? Everyone's
We
good
haven't
with
got
that?
there yet. Yes, that's it.
Brilliant. And you can't see like a bunch of typed notes over the top, hopefully.
That's all fine.
Great. Brilliant. Well, I shall start then. So I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with Daniel Hedrick's work, The Tools of Empire. It was published 40 years ago this year, which is why I've sort of chosen on this title in particular, because I think what he started needs building on. I think there's a long way we can go with it. And it's a very wide-ranging and ambitious work, but it's very much a book of its time. So in it, Europeans with their innovative entrepreneurial spirit use their technological advances to penetrate and conquer their colonies. And these are Hedrick's words, not mine. I just thought I'd give you a flavour. It's a very rousing, very straightforward story that, you know, technology drives empire. But in it, technologies kind of arrive fully formed. They're sort of fresh from the minds of their inventors, and then they're sort of neatly deployed to subjugate and rule around the world. And that's really not how I understand technology, or quite frankly, for that matter, empires. Where's the experimentation? Where's the messiness, the failures, the accidents, happy or otherwise? Where are the backstories, the deals done, the substitutions? Where's the fraud? Where, in fact, is the humanity in this big picture? So today we're really lucky, and the successes of those communication technologies allow us to access research materials that were absolutely undreamed of 40 years ago. Digitization of archives, open access publishing, Google Translate, Google Earth, social media forums, online conferences. There's a whole new set of resources and perspectives that now exist, and around which we can build new methodologies and tell different, more diverse stories. So I want to return to Hedrick's ideas, but with all these new tools. And I want to re-examine the relationships between empire and technology, between people and things. And I kind of want to, you know, loosen technology's sensible corsets and let it sprawl into messy specificities. I want to find the people again. And so for this paper, I wanted to create an archaeology that mattered. And by that, I mean an archaeology with materials right at its very centre. And I wanted to find ways of addressing what Hicks, amongst others, calls the multi-scalar debate. So how to relate those minute details of sites, of objects, of one-off events to sort of larger, connected, international aspects of telecommunications technologies. Which means, you know, not assuming the existence of shadowy forces such as colonialism or capitalism, but instead sort of sketching them out from first principles. And so I began with a small section of the taken from the Cape cable. It was made by Telcon, the Telegraph Construction and Maintenance Company, in the first few months of 1879. It was funded with generous government subsidy and was designed to put London and Cape Town in direct communication, at the time in the hope of preventing the Boer War, which is something it conspicuously failed to do. I started by identifying the materials in the cable itself. And there's a nice quote from 1877 from Ayrton, who describes it as a copper conductor, the insulator composed of layers of gutta percha joined together with Chatterton's compound, a serving of jute, and then iron or steel wire sheathing. So the first step was to work out where all these components came from, who made or dug or smelted or harvested them. I wanted to know what those industries looked like, what the workers' lives would be like, what wider social, economic or political processes those materials or industries were caught up in. I planned to trace the full life history of this cable from the raw materials through the manufacturing and the laying process, and then look at it once it's in operation in the world. I was going to try and paint a networked picture that, instead of relying on sort of single sites or locations, was going to follow the threads of the materials wherever they led, kind of irrespective of borders or languages, that kind of thing. So as you can imagine, this ended up being absolutely massive, and this will form the basis of that book that I should be publishing fairly soon. What I'm going to talk about today is kind of a stripped down sketch of this wider landscape. There's going to be loads missed out, but I hope it gives sort of something of the flavour of those complicated stories that are woven into this piece of technology. So the first material I turned to was copper, because I thought I know quite a lot about copper. Turns out absolutely none of the useful stuff. In 1879, when our cable was being constructed, it was a really interesting moment in world copper ore production. As you can see from this table, the production from places like Spain, Portugal, Germany, and especially the USA is going through the roof. Places such as Chile and the UK are actually declining at this point. So our copper could be, on paper, coming from pretty much anywhere. So how can we narrow down where? And the clue lies with the 1861 Mathiasson report, which explained why on paper, copper should be a much better conductor of electricity than it was measured to be in experiments. Lord Kelvin had already standardised limits for impurities such as tin or lead, which reduced conductivity, but was still flummoxed as to why copper still looked better on paper than it did in practice. Mathiasson discovered that the missing impurity was air, oxygen, dissolved in the metal while it was molten and evolved into microscopic bubbles during the drawing process. This long-standing problem solved, some manufacturers retooled their factories and began making high conductivity copper wire specifically for the telegraph industry. Importantly for us, the origins, supply chain and manufacturing centres of this new conductivity copper look markedly different from copper made for its mechanical properties. The leading company that emerged in this new field was the Birmingham firm of Bolton and Sons, who retooled the whole of their Oakham works to produce high conductivity copper for the telegraph industries. Because of their focus on producing high conductivity copper only, Bolton and Sons sourced their copper incredibly selectively, buying only the best picked or selected bars from dealers like Logan's in Birkenhead. When you go and rifle Logan's accounts, you find that they in turn import their copper exclusively from Chile in the form of quality controlled Chile bars. So that's copper bars which have been smelted at source prior to shipping. Chile had been exporting processed copper since the 1830s, when the reverberatory furnaces had been introduced from Swansea. These were known in Chile as the English system, which no doubt pleased the Welsh. Chile exported some 400,000 tonnes of copper that year. So how are we going to work out where our copper came from? Isotope analysis can match finished copper to its original ore, but this doesn't really help us as different kinds of ore can be found at different layers in the mine, rather than varying by, say, region. So we're left with the historical record to interrogate. Although copper ore was exported from mines throughout Chile in the 1870s, the smelters established to process the ore for export numbered only 4, 2 in the north and 2 in the south. Of these, the firms at Guayacan and Tongue were considered to produce Chile bars of the very highest quality for export. Both were owned by the Urmeneta y Errázuriz company, and economic historian Valuenza noticed that Guayacan in particular concentrated its efforts on supplying the highest quality Chile bars. So if Bolton and Sons were, as they claimed, using only the best quality Chile bars, then they were likely to be using those smelted by the Urmeneta y Errázuriz company at Guayacan. So what might life have been like at Guayacan? Smelting in Chile was largely a foreign-run industry. Indeed, the Consejo de Monumentos Nacionales de Chile referred to Guayacan as an important colonia inglesa, so English colony. And as shown here in the 1875 census, of the 2,076,000 people listed as living in Chile, 26,600 were foreign-born. The British made up a large contingent and included many skilled emigrants from Swansea and Cornwall, enticed by cheap sea passage, the abundant supply of good quality ore, and the relatively high level of wages. An 1872 letter from the managing director of the works describes the colony as numbering around 40 to 50 British workers, overseeing the running of the factory, and some 250 Chilean-born workers. According to the letter, the British employees were lodged in excellent houses and received from £12 to £30 per month, according to their skill with coal. Labourers of the lower orders were paid far less, around £5.50 a month. Water and medical attendance were provided free, and this is actually quite unusual for Chile, as their contemporaries at the mine were paying upwards of £1.12 for a 40-litre cask of water. There seems to be a massively European flavour to the whole area, which is unsurprising when you consider that Guayacan was founded for precisely this purpose. Residential patterns within the village appear to have been structured hierarchically, reflecting the socio-economic status of the workers. An article from Chile Ilustrado explains that 30 mediguas were established in the north of the village for the married Chilean workers. About 100 yards towards the south was another row of good buildings for the British workers, who were numerous. The mediguas were simple uniform rows of dwellings constructed with plaster timber or adobe walls. They have corrugated iron roofs. The houses, though basic, were sufficiently well built to still be standing and in use some 3 decades later, when the photo here was taken. So well built, in fact, that many are still standing today, surrounded by the streets that seem hardly to have changed in 150 years. I just wanted to take you on a little fly around Gaiacan on Google Maps. The whole town is a protected national monument because it's just so amazingly well preserved. Except sadly this building, which was previously the laboratories of the Ermenaz y Razores company. It's unusually 2-storey, and it lasted until 2009 when it was finally knocked flat by an earthquake, and they haven't got round to trying to conserve it or really working out what to do with it yet. But obviously, Chile wasn't some kind of empty tabula rasa that Europeans just turned up in. We can see this by the 40,000 Indians accounted for in that 1875 census. Though you'll note that they're not included in the native-born section of the census, and no differentiation is made between the sexes or different tribal origins. Around Gaiacan, these are the Mapuche people who've been continuously and violently resisting European incursion since the mid-16th century. The Mapuche had long succeeded in confining the Spanish to the centre of their lands. From 1871, however, which is the exact moment that Gaiacan is founded, the Europeans have once again begun to push into Mapuche lands. Conflict returns, and there's a constant state of low-grade war. By 1879, the time that the copper for the cable's being smelted, Europeans are also pushing north into the copper-rich Antofagasta region, sparking war with Bolivia and Peru. Surrounded on all sides by conflict over land with its rich minerals, Gaiacan sat safely between the two in the very heartland of colonial Chile. The Mapuche, forced from their lands on all sides, subject to pillage, smallpox and war, rapidly dwindle. The numbers will drop still further from the 40,000 shown in the 1875 census, reaching an all-time low of just 25,000 people a few years later. Conductivity copper is a small but integral part of this insurgency process. The quality of Chilean ores is an irresistible prize, sending both mines and armies marching ever deeper into native lands. The spoils of this conflict to be smelted by the British at the coast. The next ingredient on the Cape Cable recipe is gutta percha, a natural tree sap which, while solid at room temperature, becomes mouldable when heated and can be worked into almost any desired shape. It also happens to be an excellent electrical insulator and impervious to salt water. Gutta percha was discovered by the British in 1843, and I hope you can hear the big floating inverted commas around that word discovered, because obviously it wasn't. Gutta percha had been in use in the regions in which it grew for traditional items such as knife handles, whips, bowls, for a really long time. Gutta percha wasn't even new to England. A sample resides in John Tradescant's cabinet from the 1650s. And many items, such as the famously tough sjambok whips, seem already to have been exported and were available for purchase in London shops. What happened in 1843 was that the Victorian intelligentsia caught whiff of the stuff and immediately went about writing histories of its epic discovery and handing out medals all round. It's a very well-rehearsed hagiography, and it sort of makes up the bulk of our historical record. The first use of gutta percha to insulate telegraph cables was made by Charles Walker, electrician to the South Eastern Railway Company, who in 1847 designed a machine which sandwiched copper wire between two fillets of gutta percha. Werner von Siemens is corrected with insulating an experimental wire with it in the same year, and later laid a much better documented cable across the Rhine in 1848. But the process that really ensured the submarine cable industry took off was patented by Charles Hancock of the Gutta Percha Company in that same year. Hancock's machine achieved a seam-free wire coverage by using a process of extrusion. Gutta percha trees will only grow on a narrow strip of land encompassing the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, Sulawesi, and the island of Borneo. Trees grow in the jungles of the alluvial plains and also a short way up the foothills. So that's the area that roughly corresponds to the pale green in this picture. Annoyingly for the British, the only bits of the gutta percha growing world that they had any kind of influence over were on the Malaysian Peninsula, the areas in the darker pink here. Up in the north, there's Penang Island and Province Wellesley, which runs a little inland there. Malacca is centrally, and then Singapore in the south. So a very tiny fraction of those potential growing lands. Gutta percha trees go between 30 and 60 metres in height, with diameters of between 1 and 1.5 metres. They're slow to mature, and gutter can only be collected once the tree is around 30 years old. Obviously, the image here is staged for the camera, as the tree shown is far too small to be economically cut. Gutta percha trees cannot be tapped like latex, but have to be felled several feet from the ground using an axe. The bark of the trunk is then ringed at intervals of approximately 15 to 30 centimetres to allow the sap to run out. Coconut shells, leaves, or any handy container was then used to collect the dripping sap. Gutta percha coagulates very quickly, and the vast majority of the sap couldn't be drained, meaning that each tree produced very little. Tully estimates it's as little as 11 ounces, so that's about 310 grams of latex from any one tree. This traditional method of collection was sustainable when gutta percha was one of dozens of locally sourced and locally used jungle products. The increasing demand from the cable industry led to this becoming unsustainable. Collins, writing in 1878, estimates British imports as amounting to 1.34 million kilograms in 1877 alone, which equates to approximately 4 million trees. The crazily high prices that the material commanded on the world market ensured that every gutta percha tree was effectively subject to a bounty, driving indigenous connectors further into the forest until entire regions were cleared of the species. Oxley, who's writing in the late 1840s, notes that there's an almost complete elimination of gutta percha trees from the island of Singapore by 1847. Cerulus, writing in 1891, reports the tree as extinct from Malacca and Selangor by no later than 1875, and from Perak by 1884. So worries about the exhaustion of supply begin really early on in the discovery of gutta percha by the telegraph companies, and they become a common theme. By the time the Cape Cable was being manufactured in 1879, Kew Gardens reports that the supply of gutta percha from the British territories on the Malay Peninsula were beginning to cease. Even the expansion of the Strait settlements in 1874 to include Pangor Island and the Dingdings, also on the Malay Peninsula, did very little to ease this pressure. British eyes began to turn to Borneo and Sumatra. In 1879, 5 million trees were cut down for their gutter on the island of Borneo, and exports exceeded 3,300 tonnes from Sarawak alone. It's likely, therefore, that the gutter for our cable came not from the dwindling supplies in British-held Malaysia, but via an informal trade network from the various sultanates and Dutch-controlled territories of Borneo and Sumatra. The industry there was part of the traditional jungle products network. Indigenous hunter-gatherer groups living deep in the interior of the forests cut and collected the gutter. They passed on the raw products to the primary traders. Sometimes these were specialist members of the same ethnic group, but more frequently they belonged to neighbouring indigenous groups who were located closer to rivers for transport. The primary traders sold on to the secondary traders, who were located in the more sedentary settlements, so along the rivers or the coasts, and they in turn sold to tertiary traders in the major ports. The tertiary traders were predominantly migrant Chinese, and they'd got into the jungle products business to trade things like sago and edible birds' nests, and were now capitalising on this booming gutta percha trade. The jungle products network stands in stark contrast to other cases of colonial resource exploitation. There isn't an obvious imperial centre ruthlessly exploiting the resources of a colonial periphery. Rather, there's a great deal of autonomy, flexibility, and informality. There's no debt, no landowner, and no coercion in the jungle products market. The long arm of the British, or indeed the Dutch, Chinese, or Bruneian governments was not to be seen in the depths of the jungle, or indeed at the smaller ports. British involvement in the network only began at the entrepot ports of Sarawak and in the Strait settlements, where their job was just to funnel gutta percha onto the world market. The British were acutely aware of exactly how little control they had over this vital raw material and worried constantly about the unsustainable nature of the industry. They attempted to fix it with economic botany, the discovery and exploitation of exotic plants. Kew Gardens ran an informal network of botanic gardens established in British colonies around the world. Enthusiastic amateurs and local horticultural societies would ship promising-looking plant specimens back to Kew with any willing ship's captain who happened to be going in the right direction. McCracken estimates that a staggering 10,000 specimens were shipped annually to Kew. Once there, they would be catalogued, propagated, experimented with, and then sent out to other gardens in the network for trials in plantation-style agriculture. It's how tea came to be grown in India. There are some great materials that allow them to do this. For example, the Wardian case, shown here, a kind of portable trunk-cum-cucumber frame arrangement. Seeds of the gutta percha tree were packed into tins and envelopes and sent out to the far reaches of the empire. Saplings were propagated by the thousand and stacked onto steamers bound for British territories in the tropics the world over. The attempt was exhaustive, but to no avail. Gutta percha would only grow in the British territory of Malaya and the foreign territories of Sumatra and Java. The gutta percha of our Cape Cable was part of the steady and practically unchecked exploitation of wild gutta percha supplies. The next item on the Cape Cable recipe is Chatterton's compound. Ayrton, writing in 1877, mentions that the compound was an adhesive invented by John Chatterton of the Gutta Percha Company. It's designed to stop the layers of gutta percha insulation separating from each other and peeling off the copper core. It was applied by melting the compound in a bath through which the various layers of the cable were drawn through manufacture. It also came in the form of a thick black stick that could be melted and used in jointing cable. In fact, in France, if you ask for Chatterton's, they'll still sell you a roll of electrician's tape. Ayrton gives the recipe for Chatterton's composition as being by weight: 1 part Stockholm tar, 1 part resin, and 3 parts gutta percha. Stockholm tar is simply pine tar exported by the Norrländska Tjärkompaniet, otherwise known as the Swedish Tar Company or the Stockholm Tar Company. Since 1648, the company had held an export monopoly, and every barrel of tar produced in Sweden had to pass through Stockholm and the barrel be branded to prove it. This monopoly, though despised internationally, ensured that only tar of consistent high quality was exported from Sweden. Stockholm tar was the first choice for all naval, military and industrial purposes, and Gamble, writing in 1921, notes that it continued to dominate the market well into the 20th century. So what else could we glean about our Stockholm tar? The high quality of materials demanded by the cable industry may again give us some clues. Borgegard notes that industrial tar distillation had begun in Sweden around the mid-19th century, and so would certainly have been in operation by the time our cable was insulated. Industrial tar was considered poor quality, and again, as Gamble notes, it was considered unusable for naval applications. Even at the turn of the 20th century, the export market and therefore the telegraph industry continued to insist upon what was considered the best quality tar, peasant tar. Peasant tar produced using traditional methods as part of the seasonal infield-outfield system of production. In summer, arable farming took place on the infield lands, and grazing herds would be turned out into the forests of the outfields. Trees would be cut from the outfields and floated down the river for timber. Come winter, the herds were brought back into the infields, and people turned their attention to digging out the pine stumps left in the now frozen outfield forests. This tar-rich timber was perfect for tar making. The process seems to vary little by either region or antiquity. In fact, Willstrand argues that the methods of production remain static from 1600 onwards. The structures you can see here are called Tjärdal, literally tar valley in Swedish, usually translated as Tardale. It is constructed around a trench dug into the slope of a hillside. A pipe or a timber trough is laid along the bottom of this trench, and a funnel-shaped pit is then created in either stone or timber. The pit is lined with birch bark or flat stones to prevent the tar seeping into the ground during burning. This creates distinctive funnel-shaped earthworks, which are to be found liberally scattered throughout the forests of Sweden. The pit is carefully stacked with the stump timber, covered with peat or white moss, and smouldered in an even and controlled manner for around 9 days. The tar drips from the heated wood, runs down the sides of the dale into the trough at the bottom from where it's run into barrels. The fire must be kept to a smoulder at all times, otherwise the whole tar dale, along with all the newly barreled tar, is liable to be destroyed. According to Willstrand, this was not uncommon. From start to finish, tar making was back-breaking and labour-intensive work, but it was crucial. The infield-outfield system was largely subsistence. Everything needed was produced on the farm, and only a barter economy existed. Tar was one of the few goods produced by that system that could be traded for cash, and cash was the only thing with which people could pay their taxes. The infield-outfield system had to produce tar. Tar making could be quite a trap. Unlike other crops, tar was one of the few products that could be guaranteed every winter. This meant that tar merchants were happy to lend money against future tar production to get you through a failed harvest or a lean year. It was all too easy to get locked into a cycle of debt and increasing production as people struggled to pay both their taxes and service their debts to the moneylenders. This vicious cycle ensured that the world's supply of tar, this vicious cycle ensured the world's supply of tar. The navvies and the telegraph companies alike were reliant on millions of indebted peasants toiling in the frozen forests of Sweden. Our cable was made at the point in this cycle was reaching its logical conclusion. The traditional infield-outfield systems were being torn up and given over to standalone economies of timber and tar. Efforts to obtain tar moved ever further into the forests at a rate that Willestrand gives of 7,000 hectares a year. So that's around 5 million tree trunks. The second ingredient in Chatterton's compound is rosin, another staple of the naval stores industry. Rosin is derived from a gum produced by a pine tree when it's wounded. Tapping of trees involves making a deliberate cut in the bark and collecting the gum that drips out. When distilled, this sap breaks down into a lighter oil, turpentine, and a heavier resin, rosin. The gum is particularly plentiful and free-flowing in the longleaf pine, which flourished in the southeastern states of the USA. The Piney Woods, as travel writer Frederick Olmsted refers to them in 1856, comprised the forests stretching from North Carolina through South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama in a coastal band 60 to 80 miles wide. Outland suggests that there's something in the region between 60 and 90 million acres. Though all the southern seaboard states were thickly forested, it was North Carolina that dominated the rosin and turpentine industry, for two reasons, both of which stem from slavery. The first is that the land in the more southerly states was generally worked for profit. In South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, the forests were quickly logged, cleared, and turned over to the raising of plantation crops, such as cotton, rice, tobacco, etc. Much of the soil in North Carolina was generally unsuited to this. Profits were much more easily found in turpentining. A second factor was that prior to the Civil War and the subsequent abolition of slavery, Randall and MacDonald suggest 35% of North Carolinian families owned slaves. And it was this unfree labour that allowed the precarious and labour-intensive turpentining industry to become established in the first place. Early on, turpentining was very much a small-scale local affair. Poor white farmers living in rickety farmsteads with a handful of slaves, growing peas and beans and making a bit of cash by collecting gum and selling it on. In the decades after the Civil War, turpentine workers were likely to have been ex-slaves, or to cover the inevitable post-abolition labour shortages, leased convicts. Given the state of the criminal justice system, where a black person could be imprisoned for vagrancy or for jumping a boxcar, these groups were often the same people. It was a piecemeal picture of lots of small producers and no one making piles of money. The following description of gum collection and distillation is largely taken from Olmsted's travel journals, which are written in the mid-1850s. The descriptions would seem to still hold in the 1870s because, as Outland writes in 2004, gum harvesting changed none at all. The tools and equipment also remained the same. Boxing axes, hacks, pullers, dippers, scrapers, and stills were neither improved nor replaced. November to March were spent boxing. That means cutting an angled hollow at the base of a pine tree that could contain 1 or 2 litres of liquid. Large trees might have 3 separate boxes cut into the base. This was a job that required experience in judging, the angle of lean, the trunk shape, and the predominant weather conditions. The boxes were then cornered, whereby triangle cuts were cut to channel the gum, and the tree would be further chipped at intervals by cutting away a strip of bark above the box to encourage more gum to run. Older trees might be chipped to a height of 3 meters or more. The gum was collected from the boxes using a ladle called a dipper before being transferred into barrels for transportation. In December and January, the scrape or gum which had dried on the face was hacked off and collected for separate processing. When the tree was finally finished with, it would be felled and sold for lumber or to produce a low-quality tar. For much of the summer, the army of chippers and dippers lived out in the pines. Each worker was responsible for a certain area containing several thousand trees. Workers built temporary lean-to structures which could quickly be broken down and moved on to follow the work. Provisions such as food and water were transported to these camps from the distillery settlements in the empty wagons sent to collect the gum. These provisions were seldom sufficient, and both Olmsted and Outland note that the wild game was an important additional food source. Outland also notes that workers were frequently forced to rely on rainwater collected in the turpentine boxes for drinking. The landscape of turpentine was extensive, with hundreds of thousands of boxes in production at any one time. Wildfires could do a great deal of damage to a boxed tree, and much time was devoted to clearing vegetation and fallen debris. This also made it easier for the workers to get to the trees to chip and dip them, and allowed the barrels of collected gum to be hauled out by cart. Haulage costs shaped and constrained the turpentine industry. The barrels of gum had to be moved as quickly as possible to the distilleries to avoid a drop in quality. Distilleries were therefore centrally placed within the turpentine orchards and no more than 30 miles to a major road, railway or river. Around each of these small distilleries would be a cluster of a dozen or so sheds and cabins. Several would be given over to coopering, barrels being a constant necessity. Others would have been used for stabling or storage, or to house the overseers, the stillmen and the coopers. Distilleries were built on sloping valley sites with plentiful water, and were generally two-storey structures housing a brick-built furnace and vented by a tall brick chimney. Gum could be loaded via a ramp into the still head on the second floor. A condensing tank, generally a large barrel with a spiral, tube or worm, would be fed via a wooden launder, and you can just see that top right in our picture here. The distilling process took 2 to 2.5 hours, and at peak dipping season, a still might be fired 3 times a day. When the gum was heated to around 300 degrees, the turpentine boiled off into the condensing coil to be decanted into barrels, and the heavier rosin remained in the still. When it had cooled to the consistency of molasses, it was run out through the filter screens and packed into cheap barrels before it quickly set. By the time we reached the 1860s, prices for rosin had started to soar. It was another material that had been discovered. It was good for making soap, varnishes, adhesives and inks, as well as cables. As the exhausted forests in North Carolina were felled, the search for fresh longleaf pines to box out and drain pushed ever further south. Railways were instrumental in this, and these new lines, coupled with the opening up of new naval stores ports, such as the one in Savannah, Georgia, which is shown here, allowed for the southern expansion of turpentining. It was the newly established plantations in Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and particularly Georgia, which rose to fill the demand for rosin from the late 1860s. The new plantations emerging in the South were very different, larger, industrialised, and relying heavily on convict leasing, indebted labour, and exploitative systems of peonage, such as the infamous company store. They were a far cry from the informal, haphazard arrangements made in the backwoods of North Carolina. Images of these turpentine camps, documented by the likes of Zora Neale Hurston and Dorothea Lange, shocked the world in the 1930s. The manufacture of the 1879 Cape Cable straddles these old and new worlds of rosin production. The rosin used is just as likely to have originated on the private lands of a poor but free white North Carolinian smallholder as it is to have come from the dipper of an exploited ex-slave in a Reconstruction era turpentine camp. Rosin came with other costs. When turpentining began in the 1840s, the 4 to 5 million acres of the longleaf pine forest seemed endless. It was cheaper to abandon a turpentine orchard after 15 to 50 years and box out the next strip of forest. Orchard owners simply headed south. Abandoned orchards perished by beetle, fire, or logging, and the bare plains were turned over to farming. By the 1890s, Outland suggests that less than 10% of the original forest remained in North Carolina. Turpentining brought the demise of the Piney Woods and the rise of the wiregrass states. The next ingredients on the list of Cape Cable exotica is jute, a bast fibre plant with long fibres growing in a layer just below the outer bark. These can be made into a useful textile. In the UK, we call it hessian. In the States, it gets called burlap. Jute turns out to be an excellent insulator and resistant to the damaging effects of salt water, perfect for cable construction. Jute grows throughout India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar and Thailand, and it grows best in the plains of river delta, such as the Bay of Bengal, where land is kept moist and fertile by the monsoon rains. In approximately 4 months, an adult jute plant like these can reach the height of 3 meters. Now, I should warn you that none of the following images are 19th century in dates. They all start around 1900. And it seems impossible to find any sort of visual illustration of this process in Bangladesh any earlier than that. I've used the later images anyway to provide an illustration. It didn't change much as an industry between 1900 and about 1970, so I'm hoping that these will be representative enough for our purposes today. The initial processing of jute to provide raw jute fibre is a simple but really labour-intensive process. The plants are cut by hand and tied into bundles of about 20 stems. The bundles are then submerged in rivers or ponds, held under the water with logs or heavy stones. This allows anaerobic bacteria to break the bonds between the bast fibres and the bark and the pithy stems. This process is known as retting. This usually takes between 2 weeks and 20 days. The retted stems are then either beaten on the water or with a thapan, which is a hammer, as shown in the images here, to allow the workable fibres to be stripped from the stems. The fibres are then tied into bundles and dried either on specially constructed bamboo frames or on fences or house roofs. The raw jute fibres are then bundled and sent to the mills and factories via local dadans or middlemen. The fibres are then further processed and woven into various grades of textile. For the construction of cables, we're most interested in jute twine, but tar-soaked ribbons of woven jute cloth are occasionally used to further protect the outside of armoured cables. By far, the largest market for jute was in packaging. In the 19th century, all export goods, so cotton, tea, grain, cloth, etc., were packed into jute sacks or wrapped in jute cloths. It was the 19th century's answer to the shipping container or the pallet. Nothing could be sent by rail or sea without it. The world's demand was correspondingly high, and it rose in line with the growth of international trade. As Small explained, writing in 1860, this worldwide reliance on jute led to an odd quirk in the market, whereby fully processed jute rope or cloth was legally treated as a raw material, because to tax jute would be to tax all other industries which relied upon it. To fulfill its role as a raw material, jute had to behave like one. The cost of production had to be kept to a bare minimum. This kept profits low, discouraging any foreign investment in plantation-style systems, and also ensuring that the local entrepreneurs didn't bother much with consolidating small holdings. Instead, jute remained a family-run and family-staffed business. Fluctuations in global demand were simply met by more or fewer of the peasant workforce turning to the crop to subsidise their household income. When prices were high, more people made jute. When low, they didn't bother. As Finlow, Director of Agriculture in Bengal from 1904, noted, the subsequent huge world demand for raw materials was met entirely by the ryots of Bengal working small plots of land. In contrast to other high demand crops of the era of the European empires, things like tea, coffee and sugar, which turned to plantation systems or large-scale farming, jute remained entirely a product of ryot labour. The jute landscape in what was Bengal appeared as a patchwork of small fields based around family settlements with access to water for retting the crop. This could take the form of floodable paddy-style fields, hand-dug ponds or ditches, or one of the innumerable watercourses. Labourers retained their traditional family way of life and maintained control over the means of production. Profits from the growing of jute may have been judged as low by colonial standards. To the ryots, the money represented a good living. Hashmi describes indigenous attitudes to jute, noting that the ryots regarded jute as a wonderful crop, as they could afford all the luxuries of rural life. Economist Goswami provides us with further insights, saying, After selling their jute, they covered their roofs with tin, dug ponds, and spent money on fireworks and feasts to greet their new daughters-in-law. Jute may not have afforded most ryots what would be regarded as a prosperous colonial lifestyle, but it did enable them to live in a comfortable and independent manner. They were not, as Bengali post-colonialist theorist Chakrabarty observes, imperial subjects subsumed within an imposed capitalist system, removed from their traditional cultures and identities. So now we have our raw materials landscape, each item with its own biography, history, and wider social context, each making its own journey to England to become the Cape Cable. Excuse me. If, like me, you're now feeling a bit East Endersy, there's a very good reason for that. A great deal of what we think of as the East End was founded by cable companies. This is a map of Greenwich, West Ham and Woolwich from about 1805. And the bits we're interested in are here in red. And the thing that I'd like you to note is that they're empty, save an old brick field and some medieval drainage ditches. There's nothing much there. And then this happened. Between 1852 and 1879, no fewer than 6 brand new cable companies all moved into those empty bits of marsh. You've got Hooper's in Millwall, Glass Elliott and Telcon in East Greenwich, Siemens directly opposite in Woolwich, and the India Rubber Gutta Percha Telegraph Company in North Woolwich. The docks are filling out a bit on the Isle of Dogs, but otherwise to the east, every new enterprise on these foreshores is a cable company. The area was perfect for several reasons. First, cable manufacture has a voracious appetite for land, to store raw materials, to house engines, boilers and heavy plant, to accommodate numerous workshops, and of course to house the many massive seawater tanks in which the cable was tested and stored before shipping. Cable manufacture also requires good sea and rail links for delivery of raw materials and for the loading of cable onto the cable-laying ships. The marshes offered the potential for extensive wharfages and had previously been connected to the wider railway system by the coal-carrying Eastern Counties and Thames Junction line in 1846. There's also a third, less salubrious reason the West Ham marshes were so tempting. Early cable manufacturers with their stinking vats of hot tar and heavy machinery, lethal belt drives and smoke-belching engines were a fire risk and polluters on a fairly grand scale. For example, in 1887, the factory at Silvertown alone housed 47 steam engines and 31 boilers. In West Ham, as Powell notes, the usual regulations on pollution, fire prevention and the protection of workers were historically not enforced. You could famously get away with anything there. West Ham also fell handily just outside the geographical scope of the Metropolitan Building Act of 1844, meaning West Ham enjoyed all the transport advantages of the City of London without actually being constrained by the same safety laws. The booming cable manufactories attracted and in some cases imported people to the area. With them came a need for infrastructure, housing, roads and utilities, ferry landings, docks and railway stations, pubs, shops, churches and schools all grew up around the cable factories to service the inhabitants. Related industries such as haulage firms, foundries and coal merchants followed. At Poplar, Canning Town, Greenwich, Hallsville, Silvertown, Beckton, Limehouse, East and West Ham and North Woolwich, settlements sprang up, sprawled and merged to cover the marches within just a handful of years. The East End was born, and the germ was provided by the cable industry, which set that landscape pattern from its inception. We're now at a crucial juncture. On the 8th of April 1879, all the cable materials have been brought from the steamy jungles, frozen forests and parched plains around the world to the Telcon factory at Enderby's Wharf. They've been variously macerated, extruded, rolled and entwined into 3,852 nautical miles of serpentine cable sitting in large brine-filled tanks. It was a Tuesday. I hope you don't mind, but I'm not actually going into the cable manufacturer process here today, as actually that's quite well known and well documented. Instead, I'm going to dive off again into that larger, sort of less well-known aspects of the cable's journey as it sets forth into the world. So back to the dockside. The last of the Cape cable is being coiled at a rate of 5 miles an hour from the briny tanks of Enderby's Wharf into the bowels of the SS Kangaroo. Tonight, the ship will slip her London mooring and steam to Natal Bay, which is in modern-day Durban. The Kangaroo didn't just carry cable, but also every item which could be required for the project. The sounding apparatus to determine the route in exact detail, the testing equipment to monitor the work, and the grappling machinery to rescue the cable should all go wrong. It carried all the underground cables, the landlines, the equipment and the batteries for the shore stations at the other end, plus everything required for daily life, both on board and at their destination, right down to brooms, beds, pots and pans. Indeed, it even carried the buildings that were to become the stations themselves in the form of prefabricated flat-pack structures. The Kangaroo was, if you like, the entire Cape cable system, if not in potentia, then at least in boxes. Every detail of her journey was recorded by Captain John Seymour in his remarks book. We read that the ship proceeded across the Bay of Biscay in a gale, which is the traditional beginning to any sea adventure. They filled the cable tanks with water as they passed Gibraltar, stopped at Malta to take on coal, reached Aden via the Suez Canal, where they took on more coal, before taking detailed soundings of the seabed from Aden to Durban. The notes in the remark book, though perfunctory, open a window onto the international maritime infrastructure of lighthouses, signals and channels. Coaling, for example, is the backbone of the steamship world. Large ships such as the Kangaroo require large amounts of coal to be stored in convenient locations with a ready supply of stevedores balanced precariously on gangplanks to service them. Freedom on the seas actually rested with control of these strategic positions on land. Both Malta and Aden were territories ceded to the British in the first half of the 19th century and were pivotal infrastructure in the region, particularly after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. It doesn't help being allergic to the cat. Doing really well. On the 26th of May, after an uneventful journey, the Kangaroo arrives in Durban to discover the cable contract has been repudiated. So, writes Seymour, they sit at anchor off the bluff for 40 days doing nothing but rolling and tumbling about. This seems an extraordinary way to run a business, but does remind us that before the coming of the telegraph, all negotiations were conducted at the speed of the fastest steamer. The chief engineer's log shows he has other ideas, and contract or no contract, he sets about the project on shore. On the 3rd of June, he writes that they found a suitable landing site for the cable and the station. He then employs a local builder to construct the Durban cable house and prefabricate a second flat-packed one for shipping to the next planned station up the line, which is to be at Delagoa Bay, now Maputo, in Mozambique. The landlines are erected between the Durban Telegraph Office and the new site, and a trench dug down to the low watermark made ready to take the cable. On Monday, 30th of June, the engineers finally get the go-ahead to lay the cable proper. The laying went very smoothly. 150 fathoms of Type B cable arrived by rowing boat and was installed and buried for the shore-based section. 3 days later, the heavily armoured shore end was brought to site by Forerunner, a government tug. Sitting at anchor just outside the surf zone, the ship fires a line to shore by rocket. Buoying the heavy cable with empty oil casks, the line is hauled to shore and spliced, and the remaining cable paid out to sea. The whole process took an hour and 15 minutes. The next few days are spent installing equipment in the cable house in advance of the big laying operation. And on Thursday, 10th of July, the Kangaroo raised to anchor and set off to lay the cable. Now, I did manage to locate the site of the Durban cable house. This is the same view taken in 2007. Excitingly, the cable house is now under a car park, which is a bit of a shame. What I'd really been hoping for was to find the telltale materials of a destroyed cable house, like these ones I'd found in Cape Town the year before. Lots of brick footings and tiled floor fragments, bits of rusty equipment, etc. Or this really amazing stuff. It's so diagnostic. It's sort of a spongy concretion that you get when the iron and gutta percha of old cable coils is degraded by being exposed to sun and seawater for decades and decades. It's amazing looking stuff. It just sort of flows over everything and sets. But no luck, I just got a car park. In the early days at the stations, life would have seemed to be a bit basic. This building here that I've identified is the prefabricated flat-pack station that was shipped from Durban to Delagoa Bay. The prefab buildings shipped on the Kangaroo from the UK appear to be these units, the kitchen units, which suggests that catering for those working at the stations was organised communally rather than being undertaken on an individual basis. When you zoom in, the photograph also contains some important details for understanding what daily life might have been like. The storage tank and rainwater collection system on the end here, it's really obvious, reminds us that cable sites need to be largely self-sufficient, even in the most basic of commodities. Scattered around the site, especially back right, are barrels testifying to bulk storage of staples, hinting at the likely intervals between supply ships. To the rear of the kitchen, in the shade of a tree, lies an outdoor workshop with a workbench, brazier and an anvil. They're all larger than would be expected in a cable jointer's kit and therefore likely to relate to maintenance of buildings or machinery on site. In the far background, only half in shot in the top right-hand corner, is a traditionally constructed round hut made from local materials, alluding to relationships on site between the station workers and the local population. It all seems very much on the fly, a temporary phase of just making it work. The next phase of station life looks markedly different. Here's the Cape Cable House Mark II under construction at Delagoa Bay in 1881. It's a far grander veranda-wrapped building. Finished, it tells us much, much about the differences in lifestyle experienced by the men at the two neighbouring stations. In Durban, the cable house remains small and the employees are lodged for the most part in the nearby city. Delagoa Bay Cable House, however, provided housing for the cablemen alongside the offices and the workrooms. These men lived and worked on site. And this makes a certain amount of sense because, as Newitt notes, Delagoa Bay was just beginning a major programme of expansionary public works, which included a hospital, jail and church. The Cape Cable Station was very much part of this phase of infrastructure investment, meaning that the town was generally under construction around it. Life at Delagoa Bay seems to have been more insular than at Durban. Alongside its extensive gardens, it boasts a farm with cattle and chickens. The presence of a young calf suggests that animals are kept for milk as well as their respective meats. Accounts in the Telegraphist say that all land to the rear of the station was reserved for growing fruit, vegetables and herbs. Another clue is the dovecot, set on stilts in the gardens to the rear of the cable house, which would have provided the residents with a handy supply of fresh protein for staff dependent on supply ships or perhaps unfamiliar with local cuisine. The photographic evidence from the Telcon archive might suggest that Delagoa Bay was an isolated settlement. Like astronauts setting up a lunar base, they carried everything they could possibly need with them. And in many ways, I feel this reading's a bit misleading. Delagoa Bay was a thriving trade hub where goods from the interior were traded to ships waiting at the coast. It was a cosmopolitan place. Jenkins notes that the makeup of the population was a steady 1/3 African, 1/3 Asian and 1/3 European throughout the latter 19th century. African faces captured on the Electric Telegraph Company's photographs, engaged in building work, leaning on farm gates, or simply hanging out on verandas, testified to relationships between the immigrant station staff and local people. These fleeting images speak of an integration which is quotidian, yet seldom articulated in the documentary record. The kind of isolation experienced by the station staff at Delagoa Bay seems to be one defined almost entirely by access to European-style materials, whether these be foodstuffs, furniture, or manufactured goods. Delagoa Bay was only isolated in terms of the accepted trappings of Victorian life. The self-sufficient station complex, in design and operation, was an exercise in attaining an approximation of those expected materials. A lifestyle fortification to keep the native, rather than the natives, out. In 1879, the settlement was poised to become a boomtown. 2 years previously, the British had annexed the gold-rich Transvaal directly inland of Delagoa Bay, and plans were afoot to develop the settlement into an important port. The cable station wasn't simply an outpost of the informal British trading empire, it was the material vanguard, a piece of the vital infrastructure which made endeavours such as the annexation of the Transvaal possible. After the 1884 Conference of Berlin established the principle of effective occupation, the existence of physical infrastructure, such as the telegraph lines and stations, became an important way of materially demonstrating this occupation. When it came to claiming African land, a telegraph pole became a far more effective object to stick in the ground than a flag. There's so much more we could talk about. The development of the first synthetic plastics, the PR role of the new cable in the Zulu Wars, or the constant battle between the repair crews and the Teredo worm. Or we could talk about the global spread of football in the cablemen's wake, the international students training at Porthcurno, or the fine collection of Swahili ceramics amassed by the engineers. And that's the problem with archaeologies that follow the things. They can be endless. Where you stop is always going to be arbitrary. So I'll stop here. But what I hope I've done is draw those arbitrary boundaries in a new way, that I've managed to materialise something beyond sort of magic string by which imperial ambitions are realised. I hope it's now got a lot more people in it, and I hope that the 1879 Cape Cable now feels a bit more than simply a tool of empire. Very much. Thank you, Vanessa.
Kathy, we would normally have a great round of applause at this point, Cassie.
I'll just assume there was a...
It's a bit difficult. We can't all do that because many people are muted. That was amazing. I mean, that was a real tour de force, and it was wonderful to hear you. There's a lot of reactions coming, as you can see, with people doing their very best to clap. So, you know, that was greatly enjoyed, and we look forward very much to reading it. And it would have been so nice to have had you in person.
I know.
But nevertheless, you must be, you know, given your career, very used to doing things like this and doing them online.
And we've been teaching online for the last year too. So
I know, that's the trouble. So various people have sort of said absolutely fascinating, clap, 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 and all the rest of it. Mary Mills, if you look at the chat, who is our expert on the Greenwich area, found it rather difficult to hear you apparently, but is obviously interested in the Greenwich side of it, and has asked about sourcing the copper, and she's obviously very familiar with the companies there. So I don't know whether you want to answer that now or whether you want to communicate with Mary.
Yeah, it sounds like I should chat with Mary. That's really interesting. I'd love to, Mary. And we did exchange a few emails a few years back.
Oh, right, fine.
When we were doing a bit out on the peninsula itself. But I'd love to talk copper with Mary. I'd love to know what she's found. That would be brilliant. Yeah.
Okay, Mary. Well,
I've still got your email, I'm sure.
Yes, we can't, well, we can't hear you, Mary, unless you unmute. Okay. I still can't hear you. Never mind. I'm sorry, Mary, we can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself. That's it.
I thought I had. All I was saying that I'll get in touch with Cassie, because I think there's a way a lot of the industries interact with each other. I mean, I'm just thinking about Jute. You see, there was a massive lino works right near to Telecom Works. It's another thing. No, I will get in touch with you, Cassie. A good 15 years ago, I sat in someone's room in Bristol. We discussed how we could get in touch with you and never did.
You just knock on the door.
Right, okay. Has anybody else got any other questions for Cassie? That was a great worldwide approach to the subject and a fascinating way of handling it, I must say, looking at the constituents of cable manufacture and where you could find them. You will, of course, be writing that up for us.
Yeah, yes, I will.
Yes, so
lots of corrugated iron buildings produced in Bristol. That's definitely one worth following up on. I'd love there to be a Bristol collection.
Yes, I bet you would.
Yeah, and Dan's interested in the small holding aspects of production. Yeah, it's amazing how much of you know, the materials that come in such vast bulks to the UK are produced in really small ways around the world. That is really interesting.
Yeah. Right, Kathy is saying, could you say any more about the range of archive material you were able to access and where it's kept? What sort of sources?
Well, we're really lucky. It's moved on a lot since I started trying to research it 15 years ago. So the obvious ones to look at are down in Porthcurno. There's the
Yeah.
Telegraph Company's archives there.
Yeah.
And they hold some telecom stuff too. So they're a really good place to turn up. They're also great because the archivists know what they've got. So if you want to chat in advance about the likelihood of something being there beyond the catalogue, they're really good. We spent Institute of Electrical Engineers, text archives, keep all the back issues of Telegraph Engineer, etc. Are really worth combing because they actually give really good descriptions of materials a lot of the time. So if you want to piece together sort of what happened to cable manufacture through 30 years or so, that you can pull out the reports talking about the newest thing and what they're trying next and sort of glue that all together. They're really useful. I spent time in Greenwich archives, just at the Maritime Museum. There's not a whole lot there, but things like soundings, logs, journals of people on board ships, that kind of thing's really good at the Maritime Museum there. We spent time in BT archives, actually have some things that were useful, even though you think of them as being a bit above ground. There was some stuff in there. The Monuments Company, not Monuments Company, the Monuments Organization in Chile has a lot of online archive stuff now. So if you want images or description of particular people and companies, that's all making its way online, which it didn't have 15 years ago and wished I had. Who else is good?
Well, don't worry. Ian West has just come back and said, I'm sure your references will be included in the published article.
It will. I've also got a bibliography, which I'll put up on screen in a moment. So if anyone's interested.
Oh, okay. You might have noticed that Bill Burns from New York has put up his cable history site.
It's brilliant. There's loads of good stuff on there, and certainly some of the images I've used today are on there. And they've also got digitized John Seymour's diaries on the Kangaroo, that's digitized up on Atlantic Cable. There's loads of brilliant resources. Bill's site's brilliant.
Good. It's very nice to welcome him to this, to taking part in all this. It's also very nice to welcome several of our previous prize winners, I noticed, like Hilary Orange and Emma Dwyer. So welcome. It's nice to see you taking part in all this. Hi. Has anybody else got anything they would like to raise? Otherwise, I think we better go and let Cassie feed the cat. I'm sorry you're allergic to cats. That must have made it quite difficult for you. Anyway, thank you very much indeed, Cassie. We're very grateful to you for filling this slot. I'm sorry it couldn't be in person. I'd hoped this year it would be in person, but I'll be in touch fairly shortly, as I'm sure will Ian West, who's the main editor for Industrial Archaeology Review. So you do have the reaction bit at the bottom. If you wish to applaud, as other people have done, we'll finish there and we'll all applaud Cassie for a wonderful presentation. And thank you very much indeed for doing that.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you then. Thanks, Cassie. Right. And I just must end up by thanking Bill Barksfield, who's put so much work this year into all of the Zoom meetings, the whole of the conference on Zoom. He's masterminded the whole thing. He's sorted people out when they haven't been able to get on. So many thanks, Bill, for all the work you've done for AIA this year and at other times, of course. Otherwise,
thank you very much.
We'll leave the meeting now. So thank you very much, Cassie, and I will be in touch. Okay, bye.